This morning's scripture reading comes from the Hebrew Bible, from the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 8. And if you'd like to, you're invited to follow along as the words are printed in your bulletins. My joy is gone. Grief is upon me. My heart is sick. Hark the cry of my poor people from far and wide in the land. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king not in her? Why have they provoked me to anger with their images, with their foreign idols? The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. For the hurt of my poor people, I am hurt. I mourn, and dismay has taken hold of me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. May God bless our modern hearing of these ancient words.
A United Church of Christ minister wrote a prayer that he later published. He started praying this prayer in the mid to late 1930s. He'd pray it in events that he went to. He'd pray it to himself. The prayer goes like this: God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's now prayed almost every time a group of Alcoholic Anonymous people gather or other 12-step programs. It is known as the Serenity Prayer. And the United Church of Christ minister who wrote it was Reinhold Niebuhr. I have to take a moment of bragging. Reinhold Niebuhr was a graduate of Eden Theological Seminary, where I was president for 23 years. Niebuhr wrote this prayer and prayed it often, and he had been hearing, he was German in background. In fact, when he grew up in Wright City, Missouri, just down the way from St. Louis, his church was in German language. It was the Deutsche Evangelische Kirche of there, the German evangelical church of that village. So he was used to German, and he had German friends who in the 1930s were writing him and telling him what was going on in Germany, about the rising storm with Hitler and the National Socialist Party. He was hearing more and more the way Jews were being herded and eventually killed. And it was distressing for him. And Niebuhr, who was teaching at the time at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, started to worry and study and fret over this rising storm. And he was afraid that America, because of World War I, because we were weary of wars in other lands, wouldn't do much, that isolationism would be the way, that people would say, if there's trouble in Europe, it's their troubles and not ours. We will leave them to it. But Niebuhr, who had himself been a pacifist in his youth, and he believed that war was not the way to resolve differences. Niebuhr, who was a pacifist, sought the courage to do something about Hitler, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, but the courage to change things I can. He was invited to give a series of lectures, a famous series called the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And he prepared those lectures. They were in two sequences. The first was given in 1938 and the second in 1940. Those lectures were eventually published in a collection known as The Nature and Destiny of Man. And he hoped in these lectures that he might be able to give the moral courage or help the moral courage of America to do something about what was going on in Germany. About the same time he was praying that prayer, a man who would become his very best friend was a rabbi living in Poland. This man who was living in Poland, this rabbi, went from Poland to Germany to study, but the Gestapo arrested him there for being a Jew and deported him back to Poland. His name was Abraham Heschel, Abraham Joshua Heschel. Heschel was contacted by a seminary president. I have to tell you, whenever I hear a seminary president does something heroic, I get all puffed up. A seminary president at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati forged the ordination papers of Heschel so it would be possible for him to escape Poland and Germany and come to the U.S. And Heschel did, teaching first in Cincinnati and then in New York. Heschel settled in the U.S., but he did not fully escape because 3 of his sisters and his mother were killed by the Nazis. Heschel was asked if he would ever return, and he said this. He said if he were to ever return to Germany or Poland, every stone, every tree would remind me of contempt, hatred, murder, of children killed, of mothers burned alive, of human beings asphyxiated. Like Niebuhr, Rabbi Heschel also wrote a 2-volume set of books. His was written after the war instead of before, and in that set of books, they're called the Prophets, 2 volumes on the prophets, the Hebrew prophets. In those, he says that he set out to do what the prophets were doing, to reconcile God and man. In 1939, you may not remember this exact statistic, but in 1939, there were about 11 million Jews on the entire planet, on the whole world, not just in Europe, but everywhere. Israel, the U.S., everywhere. 11 million, 1939. By 1945, there were just about 5 million left. 11 million to 5 million in 6 years. The near obliteration of a race of people. This troubled, as you would expect, a rabbi who'd lost his own family in the Holocaust. It made it difficult for him to embrace God again because of the atrocities that happened in the world to his people, to his own family. And he tried to figure out how to reconcile this, to make this make sense to him. And so he wrote this book on the prophets. His book, The Prophets, has made a profound difference in my own life, in the life of many, because he does something in it that is just very different, very odd. He wrote that the prophets were affected by catastrophe. This is what he says. When the catastrophe came about the prophets. And the enemy mercilessly killed men, women, and children. The prophet must have discovered that the agony was greater than the heart could feel, that the grief was more than his soul could weep for. He wrote that about this text we read this morning. That this prophet is trying to find the tears to weep the terrible things that happen to his people. That was interesting enough for me, but what was more interesting is the next move that Heschel makes. Heschel had the audacity to do something I rejected at first. I wasn't so sure it was the right way to go. He started to talk not only that the prophet was speaking for himself, that he was weeping, that he was upset, that his grief was there, his joy was gone, that the summer had passed, the harvest was gone, there was nothing less. The prophet had all of that, but Heschel says it's not just the prophet's word, it is about God. About God, that God grieves as well. This idea that God is full of passion, Heschel uses the word pathos, that God is not sitting up on a throne looking down on the world, disinterested, kind of fiddling around at the edges, but instead God is in the world and affected by the world and transformed by the world, changed by the world, that grief and troubles and problems are God's griefs and troubles and problems. They're not just ours, but they affect God. This idea that Heschel sets free and starts to get going has changed my own thinking and life about who God is. It changes the way we think about who God is and the way the world is. That God is affected and feels and has pathos. When the prophet says, "Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Isn't there anybody who can do anything? Isn't there anybody who can stop this nonsense? Isn't there somebody who can have the courage to move forward?" It resonates with the prayer of Niebuhr, to have the courage to be a balm, to do what you can. You cannot do everything. We cannot do everything. But there are things we can do about the troubles and worries of the world. There are things that can be affected by us. But not everything. We must find the serenity, hard as it is, to accept the things we cannot change. And of course, that delightful prayer of Niebuhr, that we find the wisdom to know the difference. To have a God who hurts and hopes and calls us to have courage. The prayer of a rabbi and a United Church of Christ minister. Thanks be to God.